you ever wonder if the stories they tell you as a kid are true? You know, the ones about haunted houses and creepy old mansions that nobody dares to enter. Well, I'll tell you right now they are. I used to think they were all just made-up stuff to scare kids, but after that night I'll never think the same way again. It all started when my friends and I, 5 of us in total, decided to spend the night in that old mansion at the edge of town. It was the kind of place that you could walk by 100 times and never pay it any mind. The windows were black with grime, the front door sagging like it was about to collapse. But still, something about it called to us. We'd heard rumors, of course. Everyone had. Stories about people hearing strange noises, disappearing without a trace. I thought it was all exaggerated, just old myths meant to get people talking. But we were bored, looking for something to get the adrenaline pumping. There's always one person in the group who pushes things too far, and that night it was Jake. He swore up and down that the place couldn't be as scary as everyone made it out to be. He dared us, and well, none of us backed down. After all, who could resist a night of ghost hunting? So there we were, standing in front of that godforsaken house. I'll admit it, my heart was already pounding in my chest, but I didn't want to be the one to chicken out. The air around the house felt heavy, like it was pressing down on you, warning you to turn back. We laughed it off, told ourselves it was just the wind, just the old creaking of the house settling. But something in my gut told me we were wrong. I couldn't explain it, but that feeling like something was waiting wouldn't go away. We pushed through the front door, which creaked loudly as we entered, like it was protesting our intrusion. Inside, it was exactly what I expected: dust everywhere, old furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, cobwebs hanging in the corners like forgotten memories. It was cold, colder than it should have been, even for a place this old. Jake, being the brave idiot he was, led the way. He had a flashlight in hand, but it barely made a dent in the thick darkness that surrounded us. The only light we had came from our own flashlights, casting long, stretching shadows on the walls. As we moved deeper into the house, the place seemed to grow quieter, and that's when I first heard it, the whisper. It was faint, at first, like the softest breath against the back of my neck. At first, I thought it was just one of the guys messing around. But then, the whispers came again, clearer this time. I stopped dead in my tracks. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, but the others were already too busy messing with old antiques or exploring random rooms. No one seemed to care. So I shook it off. But as we kept walking, the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder. It was like someone was trying to speak to us from the other side of the walls. At first, I thought it might be a rat, or maybe the house itself making those strange noises. But the whispers had a pleading tone, like they were begging us to leave. "What the hell is that, Sarah?" one of my friends asked, looking around nervously. I could tell she was starting to feel it too. The house had a weight to it now, like the air itself was alive and watching us. I could feel the pressure on my chest, and I swear my heartbeat was louder than the whispers, but we kept going. We weren't going to let some creepy noises scare us. We'd come for a thrill, and we weren't going to leave empty-handed. It wasn't until we reached the hallway that things really started to get out of hand. The hall was long, stretching out into the darkness, and we couldn't see the end of it. My flashlight flickered, then went out. I tried to shake it, but it didn't come back on. Panic started to creep in. We'd all heard stories, right? You know, the ones where the lights go out and something happens? That wasn't just a story, it was real. I swear I could hear my breath coming faster now, but I wasn't about to admit that I was scared. Jake, of course, laughed it off. "It's probably just a faulty battery," he said. "Come on, stop being babies." But when he said that, we all heard it. The door at the end of the hallway slammed shut, hard enough to make the entire house shake. Everyone froze. I swear my skin went ice cold. We all just stood there in the dark for a few moments, listening. Then we heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere ahead of us. They weren't human footsteps. They were heavier, deeper, like something dragging itself along the floor. We all turned to look at each other, wide-eyed, but nobody said a word. We didn't need to. We all knew exactly what we had to do: get the hell out of there. But when we turned to run, that's when the real terror began. The hallway stretched longer than it had before, the walls closing in like the house itself was trying to trap us. We couldn't find the door we'd come through. It was gone. The more we ran, the more it felt like we were moving in circles, as if the house was mocking us, playing with us. Then the whispers came again, but this time they weren't whispers anymore. They were voices, clear as day, and they were coming from all around us. "Leave," they said. It was one voice at first, then another, until the whole place seemed to echo with the sound. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. Jake started yelling, "We need to get out now," but when we tried to run, something grabbed me. I felt it a cold hand, ice-cold fingers wrapping around my ankle. I looked down, but there was nothing there, nothing but the blackness of the floor. I screamed, trying to pull away, but it held me tighter and tighter. It felt like my foot was sinking into the ground, like the floor was swallowing me whole. I heard Sarah scream, and I looked up just in time to see her disappear into the shadows, as though the darkness itself had pulled her in. One by one, my friends were being taken, swallowed by the dark, until I was alone. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the shadows danced on the walls like they were alive. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen with terror. My legs wouldn't move. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the house shifted again, the door reappearing out of nowhere. I didn't question it. I didn't look back. I ran. I ran so fast that my feet barely touched the ground, and I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath, the cold night air feeling like a slap in the face. I thought I was safe, but the whispers, they followed me. Every night they'd return. They'd call my name, faint at first, but always louder. They'd come from the shadows, from the cracks in the walls, and the worst part, I'm still hearing them. They're waiting. And one day they'll come for me again. I just know it. If you're ever near that old mansion, just remember this: the shadows are real, and they're always hungry. We've all been there. Those long, monotonous hours after a shift, driving home when the world feels strangely quiet. It's 3 a.m., and you're stuck in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but the hum of the engine and the glow of streetlights to keep you company. The road is empty, save for the occasional street lamp that flickers in the distance. But sometimes, the stillness feels off, like there's something just under the surface waiting to make itself known. It's in moments like these that the ordinary can become extraordinary, and the mundane can quickly turn terrifying. I didn't expect my summer night to turn into a nightmare when I was driving home with my buddy Matt from our job at the local amusement park. We were exhausted, but there was one more hurdle to cross before we could collapse into bed: getting home. It was supposed to be a simple drive, just a red light and a couple of turns before I'd be back in my familiar neighborhood. But that night, things went horribly wrong. It had been a long shift at the amusement park. We'd spent hours running rides, dealing with rowdy teenagers, and pretending we weren't completely exhausted. Matt and I were both ready to crash the moment we got in the car. The silence between us was comfortable, not awkward. We'd known each other since freshman year, and at that hour, words weren't needed. It was just the steady hum of my old sedan as we made our way through the deserted streets. The clock on the dashboard read 3:08 a.m. We were driving down the usual route, a road that seemed empty at the best of times, but even emptier now. The streetlights lined the road like ghostly sentinels, casting long, eerie shadows across the asphalt. It felt like the world had slipped into some alternate dimension, where time slowed down, and nothing existed except the two of us in that car. When we approached the intersection, we saw it. A red light, unyielding and unblinking. I groaned, pressing my foot onto the brake. "Of course," I muttered under my breath. It was one of those lights that always seemed to take forever to change. And at 3 a.m., it was even worse. I leaned back in my seat, resting my head against the headrest, my eyes drifting closed for a moment. Matt, ever the night owl, was staring out the window, probably just as tired as I was. That's when we heard the sound of another engine. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, it was 3 a.m. There wasn't much traffic. But then from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A big black hearse, slowly rolling up beside us. I glanced over, half expecting it to be some random person driving through the intersection. But what I saw in the driver's seat made my blood run cold. A clown. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it's the only way I can describe it. The driver of the hearse was a clown. Full makeup, white face, bright red nose, exaggerated smile, and the bizarre, colorful wig. The outfit was immaculate too, brightly patterned suit, oversized shoes, and that god-awful red flower on the lapel. And the thing that made it even worse, he didn't move a muscle. He just sat there, staring straight ahead at the light, completely motionless. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just some weird person, probably on their way to some Halloween party or a late-night gig. But something about the sight of him unsettled me. The fact that he was driving a hearse made it even worse. Who drives a hearse at this hour, and why would they be dressed like that? But what disturbed me the most was how still he was, how completely detached he seemed from the world around him. "Matt," I whispered, my voice unsteady. "Yeah?" he replied, not taking his eyes off the window. "You see that, right?" I nodded toward the hearse. Matt glanced over, squinting for a moment. "Yeah, it's a clown in a hearse. That's weird." It didn't make sense, but neither of us could look away. We sat there in the silence, the only sound being the low hum of the engines. Every few seconds I would steal another glance at the clown, but every time he was still there, staring straight ahead. I don't know how long we sat there, but it felt like forever. The seconds stretched into minutes, and the light refused to change. And then something strange happened. The air around us seemed to grow thicker, heavier. I felt like I was suffocating. My skin tingled with unease, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wanted to roll the window down for some fresh air, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I couldn't stop staring at the clown. That's when I noticed it. His eyes. They weren't right. They were too wide, too intense. They weren't the eyes of a person, not really. They were hollow, like deep, endless pits. They weren't just staring straight ahead. They were staring into me, into my soul, like he knew things about me that I didn't even know myself. I shivered. "What the hell?" Matt finally muttered, breaking the silence. I wasn't sure if he was speaking to me or to the clown, but it didn't matter. Something about the entire situation felt so wrong, so unnatural. It wasn't just the sight of the clown in the hearse. It was the feeling that hung in the air, a presence that neither of us could ignore. Just as I was about to say something, the light changed. The sudden click of the signal sounded like a gunshot in the stillness of the night. I didn't waste a second. I slammed the accelerator and sped off, eager to get away from that damn hearse. Matt didn't even question it. He knew something was off too, but as we turned the corner, I glanced into the rearview mirror. The hearse was still there. It had followed us. I felt a chill run down my spine. How could that be? There had been no other cars in the intersection when we pulled off. But the hearse was behind us now, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a predator's eyes. And the clown? He was still there, just as still, just as lifeless, staring straight ahead. We sped up, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The hearse kept pace, staying just a few car lengths behind us, no matter how fast we went. I glanced over at Matt, his face pale in the glow of the dashboard lights. "Dude, what the hell is going on?" he muttered, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I whispered, panic rising in my chest. "But we need to lose him." I turned down side streets, trying to shake the hearse. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, each turn taking me further away from the streetlights, deeper into the winding back roads. But every time I looked in the mirror, the hearse was there. It didn't matter how far we went. It was always there. And then, as if to make things even worse, I noticed something else. The clown was no longer just staring straight ahead. His head was tilted slightly to the side, his grin stretching impossibly wide, and his eyes were locked on mine. A sudden bone-chilling laugh erupted from behind me, cutting through the silence like a knife. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to send a surge of fear crashing through me. I didn't need to hear it again. I floored the gas pedal, weaving through the streets, praying for some way out. But the hearse stayed with us, never breaking its pace. Finally, I did the only thing I could think of. I drove straight into a dead-end alley. I slammed on the brakes, throwing the car into reverse. But before I could make a move, the hearse pulled up behind me, blocking the way. The clown was still there, still staring, that sickening grin never leaving his face. I wanted to scream, to get out of there, but I was frozen, trapped in the car with Matt. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I glanced into the rearview mirror one last time. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the clown was gone. The hearse was empty, the streetlights flickering back to life, and the air felt a little less oppressive. We didn't speak for a long time. We just sat there, trying to process what had just happened. But one thing was clear. We'd seen something we shouldn't have, something that wasn't supposed to exist. And even now I can't stop looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that black hearse with that clown's twisted grin waiting for me in the distance. The lingering feeling of dread didn't disappear that night. It stayed with me, hanging over me like a dark cloud that wouldn't let go. Sometimes, in the quietest moments, I still hear the faint sound of a car engine behind me, low and distant, but always there, always following. And every now and then I catch a glimpse of a flash of color, a sickeningly wide smile reflected in a rear-view mirror. I don't go down that road anymore, not at night, and I sure as hell don't stay at a red light for too long. I've never been a superstitious person, but after what happened, I can't shake the feeling that something's just wrong. It all started with an old mirror I bought at a flea market. It was one of those vintage pieces, ornate, with a brass frame that had clearly seen better days. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was cheap, and I thought it would look nice in my hallway, but from the moment I brought it home, something felt off. At first, it was just a lingering discomfort, like the way you feel when someone's watching you, but I brushed it off. I've always been good at ignoring little things, telling myself I'm just being paranoid. It wasn't until a few days later that I noticed it. I was passing by the mirror, just walking to the kitchen, when I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection. It was subtle, so subtle that at first I thought I'd imagined it. I saw a figure, a shadow standing behind me. But when I spun around, there was nothing there. I chalked it up to a trick of the light. I figured I'd been working too hard, maybe a little too tired, and my mind was playing tricks. But the next day I saw it again. This time, the shadow in the reflection was clearer. It wasn't just a blur, it looked like a person, tall, with a dark outline that seemed to shift, move in a way that wasn't quite right. I thought about getting rid of the mirror. I really did. But something kept me from doing it. I couldn't figure out why, but there was this pull. Every time I walked past it, I had to look. I couldn't help it. The reflection was always there, waiting. And the figure was always there, too. Sometimes it would be standing still, other times it would shift, its movement slow, deliberate, like it was studying me. The worst part, it always seemed to be closer than the last time. Each time I glanced into it, the figure would be just a little bit closer, just a little more defined. One night I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard something. It was faint at first, just a tapping, like someone lightly knocking on the wall. I tried to ignore it, but it kept going, getting louder, closer, until I realized it was coming from the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but my body wasn't listening. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, heart racing. As I slowly crept down the hallway, I passed the mirror. I couldn't stop myself from looking at it, even though every part of me screamed not to. The figure was standing there, only this time it wasn't just a shadow. It had a face now pale, hollow eyes staring back at me. My blood ran cold and I froze. The tapping sound stopped, but the reflection in the mirror didn't. It was still there, staring at me. And then, without warning, it smiled. A smile that wasn't friendly, but twisted, like it knew something I didn't. It was like I was looking at a version of myself, only wrong. This wasn't just some weird reflection, this thing was alive. I backed away slowly, my breath shallow and quick, but I couldn't stop looking at it. I wanted to turn around and run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure in the mirror just kept smiling, that cold, cruel smile. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, the reflection was gone. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I told myself I was imagining things, but the mirror wouldn't let me forget. The next day, I tried to cover it up. I put a blanket over it, trying to hide it from my view. But that night, as I lay in bed, I felt a cold chill run through the room. I pulled the covers tighter around me, but it didn't help. I knew what was happening. The figure from the mirror was coming closer. I didn't know how or why, but I could feel its presence growing stronger, like it was pushing its way through the glass. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't run, couldn't escape. That night, I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the inevitable. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard the sound again, the tapping, but this time, it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside my room. My pulse raced as I lay still, straining my ears to hear. It wasn't the tapping that terrified me, though it was the soft whispering. It was a voice, low and raspy, like it was coming from right beside my ear. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. The message was clear. I was never going to escape it. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to get rid of the mirror. But when I stood up to move it, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The figure wasn't just in the reflection anymore. It was in the room with me. I could see its shape, tall, dark, and looming over me in the corner. My heart nearly stopped. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. The figure raised its hand, slowly, deliberately, and pointed at me. The whispering got louder, clearer. It was calling my name now, but it wasn't my voice. It was wrong, like a mocking version of myself. I stumbled back, my legs giving out beneath me. I tried to turn around and run, but it was too late. The figure stepped forward, its movement unnaturally smooth, gliding toward me like it was made of shadow. And then it spoke. "You should have left it alone," it whispered, the voice like ice running through my veins. I didn't know how, but somehow I managed to rip myself away from the room. I ran out of the house, not caring about anything, just needing to get away from that damn mirror, from whatever was waiting for me. I left everything behind: clothes, phone, everything. I didn't stop running until I was miles away, but even now, I can still hear that voice. I can still feel that cold hand reaching for me. That reflection that's not just a reflection. And if you think that buying an old mirror is a harmless thing, just remember sometimes, when you look into one, you might not be seeing what you think you're seeing. That reflection you think is yours, it might just be waiting for you to look away so it can take your place.